Hi guys, Dwight here, and I'm back today with another discussion video, and today is kind of the first part of a two-part mini-series, if you like, where I kind of want to talk about Duelyst in its current state and why I think it is so good. And first subject is largely consistency, but secondly, and in another video, I want to talk about kind of what we can do to make Duelyst a better viewing experience, to kind of push it as both an esport and a viewable game on Twitch, as it doesn't do particularly well in terms of viewer numbers at the moment. This is kind of shown by Counterplay doing a paid promotion for other Twitch streamers to kind of promote the game, but their viewer numbers kind of drop massively when they swap over to Duelyst, and there are a couple of reasons for that. But like I say, I'll go into that more in the second video. So the first thing I kind of really want to talk about is why Duelyst is so good and why it is so consistent. So as you're probably aware, if you've played the game, if you haven't, then decks in Duelyst are built from 40 cards. One of those cards is your general, the other 39 cards are your choice. Now you can have 3 copies of any card in your deck, and that includes legendaries, and so if you were to have 3 of every card that you wanted, you could have 13 different card choices, which obviously means that you're going to draw into them fairly consistently, as opposed to like Hearthstone, where you would have, say, 2 cards limit in a 30 card deck, and you would have legendaries thrown in there as well. You could have anywhere from like 15 to 20 plus different combinations of cards, discounting Reno decks for now. And so kind of combined with the draw 2 every turn, replace 1 every turn mechanic that Duelyst also has, you're consistently going to find like all the cards that you have in your deck except for very, very bad luck. And this reduces the level of variance that you're likely to experience in the game, and also means that your deck's win conditions and the way that you want to play your deck is generally how you're going to be able to play that deck as well. So you're not going to have like a really wildly inconsistent combo deck, for example, where you're kind of trying to draw into 5 different pieces or something like that, and you're never going to find them because you're only drawing 1 card a turn unless you pull in like several card draw cards, which in themselves aren't that strong. And so kind of that, in my mind, is a big strength of Duelyst. Yes, there are still games where it's going to be kind of dead draws back to back all the time, there's nothing you can do about that. But generally, how you want to play your deck is how you're going to be able to play your deck. And I think from a strategic point of view, that's a really important point, and something that makes the game much more enjoyable for me to play than other games I have played in this genre. So kind of the other side to this as well, you can have like 13 times 3. You can also use like the extra deck slots to fit in extra tech choices or more niche cards that you kind of want to include in your deck, but you're not sure whether they're really viable for a 3 of and things like that. So things like Silhouette Tracer that I've been using in my Twin Fang deck, and Twin Fang itself, I would have 2 copies of each of those, because while they are kind of core to the deck, having 3 of them can clog up my hand and isn't something I'd really want to see. I'd rather have more of the kind of super consistent, always want to see these cards, so I get them kind of all the time, and then the other cards that I kind of use to my win condition, they can kind of come later on, I'll draw into them, and I don't want too many of them like appearing early on. So it gives you more flexibility in these choices, and like I say, more consistency in terms of finding them, which in my opinion makes deck building a lot of fun and a lot more reliable than it would be perhaps in other games. So I just want to talk about kind of the pros and cons about this level of consistency that there is in Duelyst at the moment, and I'm going to go with the cons first. And the first one of these that kind of sticks out in my mind is that from a viewing point of view, it's perhaps not as compelling as something like Hearthstone is, for example. So there are cards that kind of just outright win games in Hearthstone. So you have Dr. Boom, which is like the most ubiquitous one, where it spawns 2 tokens that explode for 1 to 4 damage to a random enemy. And so if those hit the wrong targets, they can just do nothing. If they hit the right targets, then they can completely swing a game, and that kind of level of randomness is something that I personally really dislike. But from a viewing perspective, that kind of really spices things up, and it's something that people generally enjoy, and Twitch chat especially tends to like go off on that kind of thing. And it's also kind of spawned this whole subdivision of Hearthstone business, if you like, in channels like Trollden and Hearthfunny, where they make funny videos and obviously they get loads and loads of views because it is quite funny watching other people's misfortune, quite frankly, where they get completely nailed by some horrible twist of fate that happens in the game, and it's kind of enjoyable to watch that reaction. So people have tried making this kind of content for Duelyst and it's not been so compelling. I mean, it's early stages still right now. There aren't a lot of people that are kind of trying really quirky decks and things like that that perhaps would make it better viewing. But generally I think the way that there isn't much randomness in Duelyst makes it so that those kind of wow, oh my god, I can't believe that just happened, standout moments aren't going to be anywhere near as regular. And so from a gameplay perspective, that's certainly a plus for me, and for most people there's going to be far less rage quits because of some thing that's completely out of your control. But on the other hand, there isn't that kind of same what's going to happen next, this could be a huge moment type thing that you would get from like the randomness in Hearthstone. So that can kind of go either way, but from a viewing perspective I think it is certainly a con. The other thing is that because there is such a level of consistency in the game, I think if you watch any amount of games or tournaments, you can see that they generally kind of, the games play out in a similar kind of way. And so this can, on one hand, make it quite boring to watch if you already know the way that it's going to go, but on the other hand I think you kind of have to look at it as a bit of a strength as well, in that obviously if you know what's coming, if there are clearer win conditions, the games kind of follow a similar kind of pattern, then the ability to play against that and the level of kind of strategy employed to deal with it is much, much higher. And so I kind of think that is a con from a viewing perspective, but from a playing perspective, again, it's a big plus that you kind of, you form a strategy and you're not kind of hoping against all hope to get one card that's going to win the game for you. You kind of know what you're doing, can find those cards kind of preemptively and go from there, so it can go either way. So like I say, going off of that point, I'm going to segue into the kind of pros now, and I think that the consistency and the way that games do play out fairly similarly based on kind of the decks that you're playing. So say if you were playing against loads of Third Wish Vitruvian or loads of Keeper Lionel, for example, you know what you're looking out for, you know which cards that you kind of need to save, which ones are going to be the keys in that matchup. And so by having that knowledge and using that knowledge, you can kind of, you get rewarded more for trying to counterplay against their strategy than you would if, for example, you just drop a big drop that does random damage and it hits the right target and yeah, you win. So kind of that aspect of it is much, much more prominent in Duelyst, and I think much better in that you've got more chances to find your answers, you've got more chances to use your answers, and like I say, it's just generally you are rewarded a lot more for counterplaying correctly than you are in a game where you're constantly hoping to find the answer like through a top deck or something like that, because you can actually fish for it. You can take your deck to find extra ways to fish for it through things like Aethermaster and stuff like that. So I think that's really key from a gameplay perspective and from a competitive perspective, that it is much, much better and more rewarding to have consistency and have your strategy be rewarded in that sense. So also because of the way that Duelyst actually plays with it having the board, positioning matters obviously a lot more than it does perhaps in other games, and so Duelyst has already kind of bridged that gap between a strategic board game and a CCG where other games haven't really. And so that already puts it in kind of a unique space and also kind of a better place for me strategically, because there's a lot more to think about every turn and there's a lot more ways to kind of counterplay what it is your opponent's trying to do. So for example, if you're playing against an Abyssian who's ramped up like a massive Soul Grimoire or something like that, you don't have to go and stand next to them, like you don't have to take that damage next turn. You kind of can move away and position in such a way where they have to come to you, or they have to use their resources like a Silhouette Tracer to get to you. And so not only does it open up more ways to play, but it opens up more room for you to kind of play against what it is they're doing as well. So like I say, positioning in the board itself is a massive strategic boon for the game, and something that I think should really be kind of pushed as something unique and really good for the game as well. So just like to kind of finish this pro and con of consistency versus randomness argument that I've kind of gone on for the last few minutes. I'm going to go again to Hearthstone and look at stuff like the boom bots again that I discussed from Dr. Boom, and also cards like Unstable Portal, which gave you a random minion like any minion in the game for a lower cost as well, so you could play it sooner. And why I think they're so damaging is because there's just no way to play around them. Like there is no way that you can deal with that. If a mage in Hearthstone plays an unstable portal and they get something godly like Ysera that they can play on turn 7, there's like no real way for you to kind of account for that unless you are constantly running through every single possibility of what could happen in the game, which is just kind of an unrealistic expectation. There's just no way really for you to play around that, and that's why I think in a game that's supposed to be a strategy game, if you have no information about what that could be whatsoever and you're just kind of hoping you have the right answer in your hand, then I think that's kind of a problem massively in terms of strategy. So in Duelyst you have things like Red Syndra, which can do obviously damage to a minion that's nearby. There is a level of counterplay to that if it got kind of heavily into the meta, in that you can position in such a way where you make it difficult to position that Red Syndra in a place where it's guaranteed to hit the big minion, or conversely to that you can also position it in such a way where you play it where you can guarantee that it will hit the biggest minion. So there's kind of some interaction and counterplay there, which isn't necessarily the case with some of these other cards I've been discussing. So yeah, cards like Red Syndra are okay, that's kind of an acceptable amount of randomness which can be played around. Cards that are starting to creep into the game, as I've discussed, like Keeper of the Veil and White Widow, are less so, and I think these kind of need to be kept a careful eye on to make sure that they don't kind of infiltrate the game in a bad way. And so just to kind of wrap up this video before I start obviously with, like I say, my next video where I kind of discuss Duelyst as a viewer based game. And so like the kind of red-headed stepchild of the game at the moment, in my opinion, in terms of minions, is Twilight Sorcerer. And I've kind of alluded to this in previous videos, like why I think it's such a problem. But I'm going to go back over it kind of in the context of the things I've been discussing in this video. So one of the things I obviously talked about is consistency in deck building and having 3 of each type of card in your deck, or up to 3. Obviously Twilight Sorcerer gives you a random card back, and so it kind of usurps deck limits in that sense, in that if I were to play something daft like if I Flash Reincarnation a Twilight Sorcerer, that then gives me a Flash Reincarnation back because that's the only card I've played this game, and so there's an element of control to that. But also, you're obviously only going to include spells in your deck that you actually want to get back anyway. Like, I'm not going to run like a random terrible spell that I might get. So if like the card was phrased differently, where when you played it, its opening gambit was it gives you a random faction spell, I still think that would be equally terrible and not a thing I kind of want in the game, but then there's at least a chance that something bad comes back from it. Whereas if you run it in like Third Wish Vitruvian, you're pretty much always going to get like a, depending on the variation of the deck, a Third Wish, a First Wish, a Siphon Energy, or a Cosmic Flash. And none of them are really bad cards to see, and like I say, if you play 3 Twilight Sorcerers, you play 3 Alchemy Lawmasters, there's potentially a chance that you get 9 Third Wishes through that, and that's kind of a huge problem in itself, because if I'm trying to play around the notion that there are 3 Third Wishes in a deck, and I save my removal for those 3 Third Wishes, I then get hit by 4th, 5th, 6th Third Wish, and kind of how do I deal with that except including Twilight Sorcerers in my own deck to recycle my own spells to deal with that? And that's a problem. It kind of removes a part of the strategic element of the game, in that I'm no longer playing around, like I say, the kind of constructed deck limitation. I'm now playing outside of that, and I'm getting no information, unless it's the only spell that has been cast, which spell it is they're getting back, so I have no idea which it is I'm then playing around. And so that is one of the problems that I have with this card. Now, like, the nearest comparison, as I've already kind of discussed a bit in this video, to Twilight Sorcerer is the Alcuin Lawmaster. And the difference there is that the Alcuin Lawmaster can get either play a spell, depending on whichever was the last spell cast. So if I'm playing against Songhai, they use an Inner Focus, I play an Alcuin Lawmaster, I get a Inner Focus back myself. So kind of in that sense, there's an element of counterplay to it, in that if I play, not that I'm saying like you would generally in a constructed deck, but if I play a spell that it wasn't particularly very useful to my opponent, then that kind of denies them the ability, or dissuades them from using Alcuin Lawmaster, because they could get a spell back that isn't so useful to them. Whereas obviously Twilight Sorcerer is only your own spells, so you don't have that problem there. The other kind of thing to mention here is that Alcuin Lawmaster is a 3-drop, but it's kind of statted a 3/1 as a 2-drop at kind of best, and a very aggressive 2-drop at that, so it has the same stat line as a Flameblood Warlock. And while this means, like in an aggressive deck, if you're going to have to trade your general into it to remove it, it's going to do 3 damage, and that makes it very good. It also means that that aggressive deck is having to spend 3 mana for an undervalued kind of minion in that sense, which Twilight Sorcerer doesn't have any of those problems either. It's a 4-drop 3/6, which means it is just 1 attack less than a Hailstone Golem, and as we all know, Golems in Duelyst are kind of like the definitive ball of stats, that's all they do. So there's kind of no reason to, unless 4 health minions become meta and spells are terrible, then perhaps you would play like a Hailstone Golem over a Twilight Sorcerer, but that's really the only reason you would ever play that card, despite it being, like I say, it's meant to be kind of the bundle of stats, the biggest stats you can get for a 4-drop, and it still is. It's kind of not in the sense that it's just nowhere near kind of the power level of Twilight Sorcerer, with Twilight Sorcerer just being 1 attack less and it gives you a spell. There's no real downside to playing a Twilight Sorcerer at all. And that, I think, is the biggest issue. So kind of in terms of changes that I would perhaps make to Twilight Sorcerer, I think I don't really want to see much randomness in the game anyway. I certainly don't want to see randomness that kind of, like I say, usurps deck limits and kind of blows consistency out the water. And so Twilight Sorcerer could be something like the spell equivalent of Artifact Hunter, in that it draws a spell from your deck. I think that's absolutely fine. You're still having to play around that card, they're still getting that kind of answer quicker potentially, and you obviously don't know what it is, but they are only drawing it from their deck, they're not adding it to their deck, which I think is one of the major problems with the card, as I've said. I also think, like, statistically, 3/6 is way too high, it's way too hard to get rid of, and realistically Twilight Sorcerer could be dropped to something like a 3/4 or a 2/5 to bring it more in line with Artifact Hunter or Silhouette Tracer, which are supposed to be kind of other niche utility 4-drops and not just kind of the be-all end-all of 4-drop power like Twilight Sorcerer currently is. So I think between looking at the stat line and looking at the effect, there's quite a lot of changes that could be made to Twilight Sorcerer, and hopefully like Counterplay will have a look at that, because I think, as I said in my previous video about patch 0.58 in Vitruvian, I think it's one of the biggest kind of offenders when it comes to the strength of Third Wish Vitruvian. And so while Third Wish undoubtedly will get looked at, I think Twilight Sorcerer kind of needs to be looked at as well as a big part of the problem. So just in closing, like I said, I hope that kind of outlines some of the pros and cons of how good, in my opinion, the consistency in Duelyst is, and why I think it is such a great game and such a strategic game at the moment. Like I say, I'll kind of move off of this onto another video which I'll upload in the next day or so, which kind of talks about Duelyst in a viewer sense, and why I think perhaps it doesn't do as well on Twitch as it could do, and what improvements we could make to the game to make it more viewer friendly and draw more viewers in from there. So thanks very much for watching. I hope this wasn't too much of a rant. If you found it informative, if you liked it, please like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll be back soon with another video. Cheers.